When communication breaks down, connection stops being protective and starts becoming painful. So communication isn't just about listening or being heard. It's also about feeling safe. So in today's episode, we're going to talk about the specific communication patterns that are fear-based and what you can do to make them brain healthy once again. All right, so without further ado, let's get started. Welcome to Happy and Healthy with Amy, the brain health podcast for women in midlife who want to not just survive, but actually thrive during the menopause transition and beyond. I'm Amy Lang, master health coach, best-selling author, and daughter of Alzheimer's, and I'm here to help you make this next chapter of your life the best one yet. Well, hi there. Thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome back to Happy and Healthy with Amy. Today, this episode is the final episode of our special series on how social connection and relationships affect our brain health. So over these past few episodes, we've explored some of the most common patterns that can turn what should be brain protective connection into brain damaging stress. So in episode 301, we talked about how social connection protects your brain versus how isolation increases your risk of dementia. And then in episode 302, the second in this series, we talked about people-pleasing and boundary issues and how this can lead to self-abandonment and chronic stress. In episode 303, or number 3 of the series, we talked about attachment trauma and why some relationships feel like you're walking on eggshells and what you can do about it. And then in episode 304, we talked about emotional vampires and how energy-draining people affect your nervous system. And then in episode 305, we talked about the inner critic and how self-worth wounds can sabotage healthy relationships. And in each one of these episodes, I provided some very specific practical tools and steps you can take to increase authentic connection. So today, we're going to address communication patterns because, well, here's what I've learned. Even with good boundaries, secure attachment, energy-giving people, that balance, and healthy self-worth, poor communication can still disrupt the brain protective benefits of connection. So we're also going to touch on 2 hidden relationship disruptors that we haven't fully covered, and that's codependency and control patterns. All right? But before we talk about what's broken, let's get some clarity about what we're actually working toward. Okay, so we're talking about what healthy connection really means. So one of my clients, we'll call her Sue, was having the same argument with her husband over and over again. So it would start with something small. Maybe he'd leave dishes in the sink, or she'd forget to mention a schedule change. But somehow they'd end up in this spiral where both of them felt unheard and misunderstood. So one day, after yet another version of the same fight, Sue and I talked about it during one of her coaching sessions. It was actually one that was supposed to be about sleep, but, well, the fight had gotten in the way of sleep. Right? So as we talked about it, as we talked through it, she was able to realize something really important, that they weren't really communicating, which is, again, the key to healthy connection. Instead, they were taking turns at being defensive. Right? So what do I mean by that? Well, let's start with an important distinction for the purposes of this discussion. So, communication. At its core, communication is really just about the exchange of information, whereas connection is an exchange of understanding. Right? This is something that Dr. Sean Stevenson talked about. So, healthy connection requires, number one, mutual respect and emotional safety. Number two, the ability to openly express your needs without fear of rejection or retaliation. Number three, the ability to repair after conflict, because, well, two grown, healthy individuals will disagree, right? Conflict will happen. Number four, clear, direct communication instead of guesswork or mind reading. And then number five, freedom to be your authentic self without walking on eggshells. So in your brain, healthy connection reduces those chronic stress hormones like cortisol, right? It also boosts oxytocin and serotonin, which are those bonding and mood regulating chemicals. Healthy connection also helps regulate your nervous system. We want to find balance between your parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. We don't want the sympathetic one to be constantly activated. And then healthy connection protects against cognitive decline. So I talked about this at length in the first and second episodes of this series. So this whole healthy connection thing is what the Harvard study of adult development found after following people for over 80 years, that the quality of our relationships is the single best predictor of health, happiness, and cognitive longevity. And quality is the key word here. All right, so now let's hone in on number 4, communication. So without clear, direct communication, when it becomes a guessing game, this disrupts connection. And from a safety and survival standpoint, you know by now that your brain doesn't like uncertainty, right? So as a quick review, here's what happens in your brain during communication breakdown. So when you're having a conversation and don't feel seen or heard, or worse, you feel misunderstood and feel the need to defend yourself, your amygdala, this is your brain's alarm center, starts firing. Okay? And research on social rejection shows your brain misinterprets miscommunication as a threat to your social safety. All right, so think about this. We have the need to belong, right, for social connection because there's safety in numbers. But when there's a perceived threat to your social safety, it triggers stress. And your brain, it floods with cortisol and adrenaline. So these are the same stress hormones that would kick in if you were being physically threatened. Right? So when you feel unheard or unsafe in conversations, you experience what researchers call emotional misattunement. And your nervous system goes into protection mode, which makes it even harder to communicate clearly. Right? So, the hidden stress patterns that I want you to look for, to pay attention to, include predictable misunderstandings, as in having the same conflicts over and over again without resolution. All right? Walking on eggshells, where there is this hypervigilance around certain topics or certain people. Okay, what else? Mental rehearsing. So if you're replaying conversations in your head as you're preparing for conflict, or if there's an emotional labor imbalance, right, where one person is always doing the translating and managing. So miscommunication equals the slow erosion of trust and intimacy, which are the key to healthy connection, right? And here's the thing. Poor communication is rarely just about the words. It's about survival patterns rooted in fear. So we're talking about patterns like codependency and control, right? So the term codependency, I know, gets thrown around a lot, right? So what I'm talking about is a pattern where you consistently prioritize other people's needs, right? Their emotions and their problems above your own, which means you're often losing your sense of self in the process. And research suggests that this is often a result of, right, or it stems from childhood emotional neglect, parentification, which is where a child is given responsibilities that are really developmentally inappropriate and typically are supposed to be those of the adult or the parents. Okay, that's parentification. Or anxious attachment, which I talked about at length in part 3 of this series. So research suggests that this is often and problems above your own. So you often lose your sense of self in the process. And research suggests that this is often is a result of or stems from childhood emotional neglect, parentification, or anxious attachment. So emotional neglect, I think we all get. Parentification is where a child is given responsibilities that really are developmentally inappropriate and typically belong to the adults or the parents, okay? And then anxious attachment is something that I talked about at length in part 3 of this series. So if you're not familiar with those concepts, I would go back and listen to that particular episode. All right. So in codependent communication, you tend to express yourself through service rather than direct honesty. You also tend to avoid conflict by anticipating and managing others' emotions. And then this is also related to taking responsibility for how others feel, even when it's not your responsibility. For that matter, it's not something you can control, right? And then finally, you tend to struggle to identify or express your own needs and preferences. So again, I talked about this a lot in part 2 of this series when we talked about people pleasing. All right. So in conversations, this fear-based form of communication shows up as over-explaining, caretaking language, and self-abandonment. So you might say things like, whatever you want is fine, even when it's not true, right? It's not fine. Or you find yourself constantly trying to prevent others from being upset, disappointed, or uncomfortable. So essentially, you're doing their emotional work for them. Okay. Now, control patterns involve attempting to manage or dictate others' thoughts, feelings, behaviors, or decisions in order to feel emotionally safe yourself. So this usually develops from experiences of chaos or unpredictability or trauma or environments where you learned that your safety depended on controlling outcomes. Again, your brain wants to avoid uncertainty when it can, right? So in controlling communication, you would be trying to manage how others think or feel about situations, right? You might become upset when other people don't respond the way you expected them to. Or you might give unsolicited advice or solutions instead of listening. And you might be using guilt or manipulation or emotional pressure of some kind to influence outcomes. And finally, you may be struggling to accept that other people have fundamentally different perspectives or needs. So in controlling communication patterns, you might hear someone say, or you might find yourself saying things like, you should feel, or you need to, or if you really cared, you would fill in the blank, right? So control patterns often mask themselves as caring or helpful, but they're actually about managing your own anxiety by trying to control external circumstances. So again, this is if you're the one who's trying to control, okay? So both patterns come from fear, and both of them quietly destroy trust, intimacy, and the brain protective benefits of connection. Now, I want to be clear. If you recognize yourself in these patterns, you are not broken, okay? These are really brilliant adaptations that helped you survive difficult circumstances. But what protected you then might be limiting you now, right? Because when communication is driven by fear, whether from codependency, control, or other patterns that we've discussed in this series, studies show that your brain suffers because your nervous system stays dysregulated, right? In other words, you're constantly in threat detection mode, where you're scanning for signs that the conversation you're having is about to go sideways. And as a result of this chronic stress, neural inflammation increases, that inflammation in your brain. And studies show that chronic stress hormones can damage brain tissue over time. What else? Well, executive function also weakens and empathy suffers. So when you're in constant fight or flight mode, right, your amygdala is activated and essentially your prefrontal cortex is taken offline. So it not only becomes harder to think clearly during conversations, right, if your prefrontal cortex is offline, it also is more difficult to understand other people's perspectives. Both of these are not helpful. And as if that weren't enough, your memory will also decline over time. So studies show that stress hormones can impair your hippocampus. This is, again, your brain's memory center. And as a result of all of this, vulnerability, which is the key to authentic connection, ends up becoming unsafe. And your brain prioritizes protection rather than understanding. And your brain starts to expect disconnection, and then over time, you forget what real connection even feels like. So if your relationships are lacking trust and intimacy, you may be operating from outdated survival programming. And unfortunately, this compounds everything we've talked about in previous episodes. Fear-based communication makes you more likely to people please, It triggers attachment trauma responses, it attracts emotional vampires, and it reinforces that inner critic telling you you're not enough. So that's the bad news. But there is good news, all right? And it's what I've said in previous episodes of this series. Your brain can change. And what I'm going to do now is share 3 practices you can use to begin shifting toward communication that creates connection, real connection, instead of stress. So, practice number 1 is to notice and name the pattern. So when you're in a difficult conversation, I want you to pause and ask yourself, am I communicating from fear or from connection right now? Remember, the definition of connection is an exchange of understanding. So if it's fear, then I want you to ask, am I over-functioning or trying to over-control here? So just noticing the pattern without judgment starts to create space between you and the automatic response. All right? Practice number 2 is to use emotional repair language. So when conversations go sideways, and they will, you can try one of these phrases. I see that what I said hurt you, and I'm really sorry. Or, I'm not sure I understood. Can we slow this down? Or, this relationship matters to me more than being right. And then finally, I don't like how that came out. Can I try again? So these phrases signal to another person's nervous system that you're committed to connection, not to winning. All right? And if you want more examples of emotional repair language, try using ChatGPT and ask for more suggestions. All right? Practice number 3 is to root in connection, not control. So before you speak, ask yourself, what would help us both feel safe and understood right now? So healthy communication is built on presence, curiosity, and what researchers call mutual regulation. So helping each other stay calm and connected rather than activated and defensive. Right? So a really helpful and practical tool for staying connected to both your own experience and the other person's nervous system is the WISE communication method, which I shared in episode 272, the Essential Stress Response Toolkit. All right? So why does this method work? Well, because it helps you express your needs while avoiding blame as well as defensiveness. So WISE, W-I-S-E, stands for the following. The W is when. So when I see or hear something, right, you're describing a situation. I then stands for interpret. So here you're going to share what you're thinking, right? How you're interpreting the situation based on what your senses took in. S then stands for share, as in sharing your feelings or emotions. So this is based on understanding that it is your interpretations that are driving your emotions, right? And then E stands for express what you need. And when it comes to any kind of conflict or argument, I would suggest here that expressing what you need is in the form of a request. Okay, so using this method was truly a game changer for me in my relationship with my dad. And if you want specific examples of how to use this wise communication method, please go check out episode 272. Right? So, in conclusion now, we've spent this series identifying the patterns that lead to unhealthy, harmful communication. Right? People-pleasing that abandons the self. Attachment trauma that makes vulnerability feel dangerous. The inner critic voices that tell us we're not enough. Emotional vampires that drain our energy. And now, with this episode, fear-based communication patterns that wind up creating fear instead of safety, and distance instead of intimacy. But here's the truth. Connection can heal too, right? When it's safe, secure, and honest. So, healthy communication doesn't mean perfect. It means repairable. So, your voice matters. And so does the other person's, right? You'll discover you can finally exhale when communication creates safety instead of stress. And small changes in how we communicate can create significant changes in stress levels, which then directly impact your cognitive health, right? And then the added bonus is that improving communication amplifies all the other brain protective factors of social connection. So when you can express your wants and needs and preferences clearly, you don't need to people please. When you can repair after conflict, attachment trauma gets healed instead of reinforced. And when communication feels safe, your inner critic gets quieter, right? When you set good boundaries through communication, emotional vampires lose their power. And this is especially crucial during midlife because with the brain changes that we experience and those hormonal transitions, stress regulation becomes more challenging. So, here's your practical takeaway for this week. Choose one communication pattern to notice. And when you catch yourself communicating from fear, whether through overfunctioning or over-controlling, just pause and ask, what would connection-focused communication look and sound like here? And if you don't catch yourself until after an argument, that's okay. The fact that you noticed is a huge step forward. And you can still ask, what would connection-focused communication have looked and sounded like here? Right? And remember, you don't need to overhaul everything at once. Small shifts create significant change, right? Small hinges swing big doors. So inside my program, Second Spring Society, this is my new brain health membership for midlife women who want to thrive during the menopause transition and beyond, right? We're going to be exploring emotionally safe communication, as well as boundaries that restore clarity and calm, and healing those deeper patterns that I talked about, right? Not just managing them. And really, because your second spring isn't about performing anymore. It's about connecting. So, if you want to sleep better, stress less, and protect your brain from Alzheimer's, you can join the priority list at moxie-club.com/society. So I've included the link in the show notes, and if you're watching on YouTube, you'll find the link in the description. or you can just scan the QR code here, right? Again, I laugh because there's really no QR code there, right? So remember, when we communicate from connection instead of control, from presence instead of fear, we're not just protecting our cognitive future. We're improving the quality of our relationships, which is the key to our happiness and a good life. So, if you found this episode helpful, please share and subscribe. It really does let the algorithm know to make this episode and this podcast more discoverable. And I'm on a mission to reach more people here, right? Of course, if you have any questions, feel free to comment or email. And if you haven't written a review yet, please consider doing so. All right? So, finally, thank you so much for joining me for this series on love, relationships, and brain health. And I'm going to wrap up today's episode with a quote by Brené Brown. Connection is why we're here. It is what gives purpose and meaning to our lives.